The situation is most unfortunate, but I don't make the rules.
But you do play the game, don't you, Garrick? And there is a game being played right now as we speak, isn't there?
There are always games, Doctor.
So, I had about a half-hour rant about this topic recorded already, sitting, well, primed to be used for a video. And then I decided it was a bit too long, there were a bit too many sidetracks, even for my taste, and decided to do the whole thing over again. A little bit of a background story here. About a month ago, there was a conversation I had on Twitter about politics in gaming. Yes, that old chestnut. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned that in my eyes, the game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was not only not a politically preachy game, but in fact I would go as far as to say that it isn't political at all. As Twitter conversations go, the third participant in that conversation being an idiot, the conversation didn't lead to much, but I promised at least the first participant that I would record a little video on this. Now, this rant has been sitting in the back of my head for quite a while, I think for almost a year at this point. I'm not quite sure about the time frame, but essentially when the announcement for the sequel to the aforementioned game, Bloodlines 2, came out, the usual discussion about politics in gaming started once again when it was revealed that there would be gender pronouns in the character creation of the game. Now, to give my very abridged opinion about this entire deal, about this entire issue, in a real-life context, I do think that this whole progressive approach to personal pronouns is idiotic. It's idiotic on a linguistic level because personal pronouns are not personal in the sense that they're your possession. You don't get to decide what language you own. And it's even idiotic under the premise that it's what it's supposed to achieve, namely increase acceptance of transgender folks in the general public. Because I don't know about you, but running around and demanding from people that they should address you in a certain way with a certain title, even, especially since this is the thing with personal pronouns in the progressive context, it's always about third person pronouns. So they demand you to talk about them in a certain way, even in their absence or in reference to them. And yet doing that, especially under the threat of defamation, should you decide to not comply with that demand, that doesn't increase acceptance, that just makes people more likely to tell you to fuck off. But within the confines of the game, I actually have to say that I never had and still don't have an issue with personal pronouns being introduced, because as far as idiotic as I think it is, the reality is a significant number of people currently believe it's something good in any way, or shape, or fashion. And a role-playing game that is set in 2019 and plays in Seattle, of all places, the hipster capital of at least Washington State, if not the entire USA, yeah, it makes absolute sense. I might not like it, I might think it's idiotic, and I will not use it in the intended way, but there's no problem with it being there. That, of course, didn't stop people to start up the usual conversation about games being politicized. And one argument that came up repeatedly was, well, haven't you played the original Bloodlines? That game is political as fuck. And to examine this, I think that we first need to establish that there are, in my opinion, 4 ways in which you can integrate politics into entertainment in general, but I will use games as an example here. The first one, obviously, and I'm kind of being a cheeky bastard here, is of course you don't. You can simply make a game that has no politics in any way, shape, or fashion in it. Classic games like Tetris or Pong would probably be an example. Not that it would stop people from interpreting political context onto these things. I mean, I say that as someone who actually had a discussion with a professor back when I was in university, who proclaimed that it doesn't matter if even the original creator of a product says that there is no political anything, as long as someone can interpret something onto it. The second way is the one that is usually referred to when people say, I don't like my games to be political, and that is the preachy way. That is when the writer, or maybe even the entire studio, the main developer of a game, decide that, you know what, developing a game is not enough. We need to make a statement. We need to make a specific statement, and we need to make sure that everyone who plays our game gets that message hammered into their fucking skull. Now that attitude alone is annoying enough, but it's not actually why such games are looked down so much upon. The main reason is because usually this soapboxing comes at the expense of storytelling, word building, and character consistency. So villains who have been portrayed as ruthless and would destroy the main character, or at least attempt to do so at any given opportunity, suddenly stand perfectly still as the main character or a supporting character stops short of turning towards the player and start preaching about, I don't know, the oppressed minorities of the world, how we should save the planet, or to give peace a chance, or any such shallow opinionating. And I'm not against any of these positions before any smartest comes on the idea. It's about the shallow approach that such soapboxing usually employs. The second way to introduce politics into your game would be the quote-unquote right or correct way, when it is an integral part of the game but it is treated mature, or I take that back, when it is treated reasonably. The difference between the first and this example would, I would say, more likely be that the first example, the preachy way, is when people tell you what you should or shouldn't believe in or think. Whereas the second way would be a more of an examining approach. The director, the writer, the programmer, whoever is responsible for this approach, presents a political issue, presents as many sides on the issue as he is aware of, but doesn't punish the player for deciding to go a way that he personally wouldn't agree with. The goal is merely to present an issue and let the player decide, or not to decide, but to process the information that he just got presented with. Now, smart authors often try to conflate those two approaches for winning an argument. And it smacks of dishonesty, and this is actually what incited me to pick up this rant again. And yes, I mean to say that I had this rant sitting in the back of my head for quite a while. I'll spare you the details. It's the main reason why this video is much shorter than the first one I recorded. But for the sake of this argument, I think it's this moment where it's most worthwhile to point out that, yes, technically, really technically speaking, if someone says that a game is political, that would include absolutely any game where politics are either a core part of the narrative, if you want to be particularly pretentious today, a part of the game's themes, or I emphasize a core part of the game's themes, or in some cases are even significant to the game mechanics. That is the technically correct definition. However, when people say that they're tired of politics being shoved down their throat or shoved into their games, they mean the first variant, the obnoxious preaching, where the actual game, as well as the story and the characters, take a backseat to the writer's proselytizing. And before you go down that road, no, I'm not twisting reality in my favor here. People using a technically incorrect verbiage for the sake of brevity has been a thing since human communication has been a thing. And it's especially true on social media platforms, especially ones like Twitter, where there's an absurd character limit and no editing function. Otherwise, we would spend hours writing down entire forum threads just to make sure that we clearly explain every nuance and facet of what we want to say. A bit of common sense is expected if you want to argue in good faith. Which brings us to the last variant or the last way in which you can implement politics into a game, and that is, I guess the best way to describe it, the innocuous way, where politics are present. They're not particularly important to the story, they certainly have no impact on the gameplay, but there are some interactions that either distinctively are, or could be interpreted as political in a more narrow or broader sense. What differentiates this approach to the second one, and yes, I ignore the technically first one of not implementing politics whatsoever. I'm just talking about the three variant: preaching, examining, and this one. And what differentiates this one from the previous approach is that here political themes or interactions aren't brought up in order to be examined. They're tools to push the actual plot forward, which might be an interpersonal plot, it might be a love story, for instance. Whatever the actual plot is, it's not a political one, but there might be some political circumstance that is used as a plot device to push forward, but the politics themselves are utterly irrelevant to the story, and of course, therefore, they will also be completely irrelevant to the gameplay or the game mechanics. And it's in this latter category that I would put Bloodlines. Now, I see how people can disagree with me on this one. I myself thought for a very long time that Bloodlines 1 was a political game in the sense of the second example, the examining approach. After all, it plays in the setting of Vampire the Masquerade, which is an inherently political setting. I mean, every major faction is a political faction. It was, funnily enough, when I wanted to formulate the original form of this rant, back when, the Bloodlines 2 announcement was made, and I wanted to establish Bloodlines as an example for a political game done right, specifically talking about the endings, that I realized the game isn't political at all, really. Now, there are, of course, definitely political interactions and conversations about political topics in the game. I'm not denying that, and I want to take this opportunity for another short intermission, because in the camp of the people who want to argue that Bloodlines 1 was deeply political, they strangely always just bring these examples of jokes, of throwaway jokes, to make their points, like that you can say, I voted Republican as an example for a confession in the, confession nightclub, or the throwaway gags about Republican and I think even Democrat senators that you can hear on the radio when you're in Santa Monica. And this is weird to me, because if you want to make the sincere point that Bloodlines 1 is a political game, you might just as well want to start with an actual argument, like, the fucking opening scene, which is a clearly political presentation and interaction. Or you might want to go with something that was named in the aforementioned Twitter conversation. Nines Rodriguez complaining about how he grew up how he lived through the Great Depression and saw how the rich never paid or suffered, whereas the poor people had to endure all the hardships of the Great Depression. And as I said before, this is clearly political interaction, or at least a political topic. Now, since I want to keep this video short, I'm not going to do an in-depth examination of every example of political interaction I can think of. So I'll leave you with the somewhat controversial statement, or disagreeable statement, that none of those political topics, conversations, or interactions are actually relevant to the game's plot, and certainly not to the game mechanics. Siding with the Prince or siding with the Camarilla or the Anarchs doesn't change the course of the game at all. In fact, if you decide to side with the Anarchs, Damsel will tell you to go back to the Prince and pretend like you're still on his side. If you then inform the Prince that you're playing double agent, he tells you in no uncertain terms that he's well aware of that and doesn't give a shit. Niles Rodriguez telling you about how the Great Depression was unfair to the poor people. I mean, some people claim that Bloodlines has political messages. Can I just ask what the fuck the political message is supposed to be here? That the Great Depression was bad for poor people? That's not a political message, that's basic observation and logical thinking. Since there is also no way for you to completely alienate, or even just kind of alienate, any of the factions with your choices during the gameplay is virtually unimpacted by anything political. And the story... Guys, the story is not political at all. The plot of Bloodlines 1 is not a political one. When you really look at the story, at the journey of the main character, the political themes that could be picked up are left completely untouched. You don't play the different parties against each other. You're not furthering one faction's interests over another one. You're playing for the character itself. Hell, even your siring is left completely untouched. That would be a political topic, right? I mean, as I said before, the trial at the beginning of the game is a political interaction. Never touched again. No, the plot of Bloodlines 1 is a mystery plot. What is the core element in every single step of the story, in every single chapter? The Uncaran sarcophagus. The big question of Bloodlines 1 is a fucking... it's a fucking Hellsing Abridged sketch.
Who gets the box? What's in the box? How much is what's in the box worth? Storage Wars.
And now I made myself sad. But the point remains, nonetheless. Bloodlines 1, certainly, with absolute certainty I can say that, is not a political game in the first sense. It's not a politically preaching game. And I would say that the lack of impact that political conversations and interactions have on both the gameplay or the story also make it not a political game in the second sense, which leaves only the third variant, that politics are present but are essentially irrelevant to the game itself. And that makes Bloodlines 1 as much a political game as the existence of sex or sexual themes in the game make it a porn game. Or talk about war makes it a war game. You catch my drift. And this is not to the detriment of the game. This is not... The purpose of this rant is not to say, oh look, Bloodlines 1 isn't as good as you think it was. I still absolutely stand with my statement of quality of the game that I gave at the end of my playthrough. In fact, thinking back, I probably would want to remake that to be a bit more elaborate there. But the point of this video is not to discuss whether Bloodlines 1 is a good or a bad game. It's to discuss whether it's a political game or not. And while I don't live under the illusion that I will magically convince someone of it, I would say that if you honestly examine the impact of the political elements of Bloodlines 1, you will realize that it's not, that neither in story nor in gameplay is it at the core, or even a part of the core of that game. And thus, I have no issue whatsoever saying that Bloodlines 1 isn't a political game in any way, shape or form. So, thanks for your time. Hope that it was at least somewhat informative, and see you around.